Hello. So that was an amazing set of presentations. I hope everyone else enjoyed them as much as I did. And well, there's so many connections between your works. I'm just writing down words as you were speaking and drawing, as you do when people are talking. So just some immediate observations was the idea of like just the string and the twine and the string maps. You were talking about being attuned to the space. Obviously, Monty, you were talking about people in space, feeling space when they can't see physically, and how obviously sonic materiality, actually enables someone to feel that space. I found that really fascinating. I suppose my first question for you would be, how did you see the relationships between your work?
So I think it's really interesting to think about the different uses of strings and to think about sound. For me, the use of strings connects more directly with the nervous system. And that's how I think about it. And then you go into sound and the senses, and it connects, I think, the physical with the non-physical and the physical body with the senses.
I think from my point of view, looking at your work was really quite fascinating, because often a lot of the performances that are done with spatial sound are often done in black boxes where there is nothing to look at. In Montreal, it's called the Rien à voir series. And I suppose the thing about it is how your senses become quite attuned to appreciating sound in a very different way when the visual is taken away. Obviously, it's something that blind people talk a lot about, but the more you actually listen to sound, the visual stimuli that come from it are really quite remarkable. And I think the thing about the spaces where you work is they're almost like encapsulated small spaces, where I can imagine the detail of the water is actually, you become attuned to that really very, very quickly. And as a result, the kind of texture and the pieces that you make seem, on the one hand, they're these huge spaces, but the actual results are incredibly intimate, if I can interpret it like that.
Yeah.
And it's that sense of intimacy with the sound that I think is actually one of the corollaries and how it's drawn together.
Yeah, and for me, that space of performance is, even if it's a performance for camera or it's a live performance for audience with sound, is a space to listen more closely, and that's definitely part of the experience of making the work. I've actually arrived at sculpture via sound and objects, and I was interested in the sound qualities even before I was interested in sound and physical qualities, even before I was more interested in the visual and formal elements. So yeah, it's definitely that sort of heightened moment of listening more intently and closely.
I really like the image you had of the Hepworth strings correlating with the sound waves. That was really interesting. Nothing I've ever thought of before, for sure. Yeah. Hello, can you hear me now? Oh, it's the closest. I was just saying I like that picture he put of the Hepworth strings next to the sound waves. That was really something I've never thought of before, ever, for sure. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose the interesting thing about that is, obviously, we know about Hepworth's interest in music, her relationship with people like Michael Tippett, Benjamin Britten, and Rainier, and so on. But I suppose the thing is, when you start taking a step back and you look at the conceptual ideas and how they relate to wider modernism and other ideas that were prevalent in Paris and so on at the time, you're really starting to see those connections as her being part of an international movement of contemporary art and thinking, rather than just an artist based in the south of England.
Yeah. She did all the performance pieces as well with music and the large sort of pieces for theatre and dance. So yeah.
Yes, I think she did all the set design for some of Tippett's operas as well, didn't she?
Yeah.
So yeah, fascinating.
I'm sure there's a lot of people in the audience that would like to ask questions, so I'm going to throw it straight out to the audience. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question?
It's for Roseanne. I just wonder if you have ever worked in Scotland, in the Scottish landscape. Got
Sounds
good
like a good
ro-
idea.
And good while swimming, but in the better months.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is I was swimming here as well, but it's obviously a different experience down there. I think what it offers down in West Cornwall is just the opportunity to be outdoors more, literally because of the mild conditions, to work outside more. So yeah, I would like my next studio to have more outdoor space and to be able to work, you know, the way that Barbara Hepworth described being able to work in the way that she did. That's one of the things that really inspires me about Barbara Hepworth's work, is how she maintained those conditions that she needed for her work, and what that involved, and yeah, complete life goals to be able to obtain that studio setup and conditions, and to really think about that and what you need as an artist.
Just think the Scottish geology might interest you,
Yeah.
but also I don't know if you've heard of Cove Park on the west coast and their artist studios and residencies.
Right.
But we can talk about that over
Yeah,
lunch.
okay, great.
I think there's something there about the experiential as well, which we sort of touched upon in the first question. But I think your point there about how, for me, it's something to do with how we as an artist or a conservator or a musician, how when you're making the work, the experience of making the work, what that involves. But then there's also, you're aware, or I'm very conscious of, and I wonder if you are too, the experience of the audience or the viewer or the people that come into contact with the work. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Do I keep pausing?
Keep passing it. I think from my point of view, what I talked about in relation to not just responding to a work, both with the students that I work with and in some of my own work, I think it's really important to, or the more detailed an understanding you have of how a work was made, the greater the way it can inform the making of a new piece in a different art form. So, for example, with 3D sonification, one of the things I hate most is when there is a very simple translation from one medium to another, from some type of data into pitch or MIDI information, because it means absolutely nothing for the audience. And it's great, it's a buzzword to say these things are sonified and so on, but for me it's when the audience comes in and they can make some kind of tangible relationship between how the space has been thought of and what the model for that space was, whatever it is, but actually then the work of art transcends that, and it's not just about a sonification of that, but it gains a new meaning from that. And I think it's when you can communicate that's where I think the kind of formal thinking really starts to develop in new and exciting and interdisciplinary ways.
I would say I just don't want to mistranslate an artist's work ever. None of them, Hepworth, all the other artists. So that's why I look to what's been done before, what's been said, and I really don't want to translate it differently. So it's quite important to. That's why I was saying about the colour of the strings. Some of the colour of the strings was really important to her. So should we be just refreshing them all, or should we be putting back what's there? Yeah, I don't want to sort of get it wrong. Yeah. Always what the artist wants is the key thing, but sometimes you have to temper it, because sometimes, the owner or whoever it is does not want you to replace them. So then there's a historical thing there, but then you're looking at, if that's wrong, I mean, obviously, if an owner said, I want these strings painted pink, that would not happen. But if the owner says, I don't want them refreshed, I want them as they are, it's an interesting one. But sometimes the contrast isn't enough, so, yeah.
I do think about the audience. The audience for the way that I was working last year, but the way that I continue to work is partly during the process of making the work, which I really like the experience of an audience of a sculpture being able to see it halfway through, or being able to see a performance leading up to that sculpture. So yeah, like when I was working on the Bride Stone, people were coming up to us while I was trying to use plaster, which was going to dry in about 5 minutes' time. It was kind of like really challenging to have people in that environment. I'm like, will you go away from the Bride Stones for a bit, please? But in another way, having conversations with people who might not have seen the work otherwise. There's a particular guy who came up to us and said, have you just cracked that stone? And I was going to start getting, told off for what I'd done to the Bride Stones, but it meant that he was looking at these stones in a way that maybe he wasn't before, and that we could have this conversation about these sculptures. And it really helped that they were going to be exhibited at Yorkshire Sculpture Park and here at the Hepworth, because the galleries that people have a relationship with, and then they could go and see the work afterwards. Maybe that's got a relationship with, I don't know how open Hepworth was with the public and the sculpture garden, but being able to see her works in progress is really inspiring. I know that she had people visiting the studio through invite, but yeah.
More questions?
I actually was going to say lunch has arrived, but we'll do a couple more questions.
I was just for Monty Adkins, because you talked in a way that opened up a quite different world than we normally hear about. But then at the end, it seemed to close down a bit in that you said, how could sound illustrate museum exhibits? And it seemed almost as if that would be a kind of literal translation. And I just wanted to ask you, what did you mean by that? And did you mean how it could illustrate museum exhibits for people who couldn't see them? And are we thinking then about aids to viewing or understanding, which might be better and alternative to the very limited aids we have at the moment in museums for people who are visually impaired?
I didn't mean to close it down. It was not meant as a closing slide and a closing down of the argument. I suppose the point was to highlight the fact that we're now getting to the stage where sound spatialization has often been thought of, as I said during the talk, as the kind of fairy dust that makes the room or amplifies the particular piece, especially in sound diffusion of electronic music. But actually, we're getting to the stage now where we can actually think of it in artistic terms as a more kind of structural and formal element. And I suppose the sonification example about the museum exhibits was being able to quite concretely think about how spatialization has quite an important role in being able to think about space in a much more, I suppose, a much more kind of scientific way. That it has an application that has not really been possible in the past few decades, but is now actually becoming possible. So yes, I suppose it did close it down by starting to talk about museum exhibits, but to me it's part of a larger narrative about the function of sound spatialization and what we can now do with it, rather than it just be something that sounds great at the cinema or in arts practice, adds something to the space in which we display work or present work, but now has a much more kind of formal capacity. Well, I mean, we are getting to that kind of stage, yes. Some of the work that Annika and I and Kristen and Cara have been doing with Brass Arts has been doing kind of point cloud, I suppose, images of certain spaces. And one of the things that Louis is doing in Montreal is taking point cloud representations of objects. And at the moment, his research and his research team is literally just about sonifying those and how people who are visually impaired can understand those. The interesting thing then, going a step further, as a kind of sonic artist or a practitioner working with sound in space, is how you can actually create virtual objects in a space. That you can actually walk into a room and actually, just with a pair of headphones, have three-dimensional virtual sound spaces, for example. Sound objects that are very perceivable. We can think about their density, their weight. And it could literally just be an empty box. But yet with a pair of headphones and sound, if a person is blindfolded, we can now get to the stage where we can actually start and fill that with virtual objects, virtual sculptures. That's where it starts to get exciting. But of course, I'm also aware that it has a very practical application as well.